Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're tackling a really surprising idea from an even more surprising source. We're talking about legal fairness and flexibility from a man whose name, let's be honest, has become a synonym for being rigid and severe, John Calvin.
Okay, let's just do a quick thought experiment. When I say the name John Calvin, what's the very first word that pops into your head? Just think about it for a second.
For a lot of us, I'm betting it's something like this, right? Strict.
Or maybe harsh?
And almost certainly rigid. You know, the popular image we have is of this unyielding, stone-faced guy who was all about the rules.
But what if I told you that this very same figure was actually deeply, deeply concerned with making the law more flexible, more humane, more just? That hidden inside his legal thinking is a concept that kind of flips everything we think we know about him on its head.
To really get Calvin's big idea, we first have to wrap our heads around a legal puzzle that people have been wrestling with for, well, centuries.
And it's a huge dilemma, right? You can have a perfectly good law on the books, but then a specific situation comes along where following that law word for word leads to a result that just feels completely wrong. It's that gap between what's legal and what's actually right. Now, Calvin got this. He was trained as a lawyer long before he was a famous theologian, so he was super aware of this tension. He totally understood the conflict between the literal text of a law, the letter, and what it was trying to accomplish, the spirit.
And look, he wasn't pulling this idea out of thin air. He was tapping into some really ancient wisdom, captured perfectly by the Roman statesman Cicero. The idea that sometimes the most rigid, by-the-book application of the law can actually create the biggest wrongs.
So what was Calvin's fix for this? Well, he developed this incredibly powerful concept he called equity, and it has two distinct parts that are totally inseparable. You need both for it to work.
So first up, you have equity as this big, abstract ideal. Think of it like a universal North Star for justice. For Calvin, this standard came from something called natural law. This idea that we all have an innate moral compass, a sense of right and wrong kind of engraved on our hearts. Every single law, he said, should be aiming for that North Star.
But, a perfect ideal doesn't do you much good if you can't actually use it. So the second part of equity is all about application. This is where the rubber meets the road. It's the real-world power of a judge or a ruler to look at a case and say, you know what? The written law is just too blunt for this situation. I'm going to bend the rule to get to that higher, truer justice.
Let's make this real with a classic example. Imagine a starving mother steals a loaf of bread to feed her kids. The letter of the law just sees theft and says harsh punishment. But a ruler who's using equity, they look deeper. They consider the circumstances, the poverty, the desperation, the motive. And that ruler could then choose to lessen the penalty, stepping away from the rigid law to do what's truly just. That's equity in action.
Now, this all sounds pretty great, right? A perfect solution. But here's the catch. This idea created a huge intellectual problem for Calvin, and it came directly from his own core beliefs about human nature.
This is the deep tension in his thought. See, if you believe that all humans are fundamentally sinful, that our judgment is clouded, well, how can any flawed ruler possibly have the clear vision to see that perfect North Star of justice and apply it correctly without messing it up?
Calvin's answer here was, well, it's pretty nuanced. For him, it all depended on who the ruler was. He argued that a non-Christian ruler could get a glimpse of this natural law, but only imperfectly, through their flawed conscience. It's like their view would be foggy. But a Christian ruler, well, they had their conscience plus two powerful tools, the clear laws in the Bible and the direct guidance of the Holy Spirit. And that, Calvin believed, gave them a much clearer shot at achieving true equity.
So why are we even talking about a 16th century legal theory? Does it still matter? Absolutely, because understanding this gives us a much richer, way more complex picture of Calvin and his world. This isn't just some dusty historical debate. In fact, getting a grip on his idea of equity really changes how we view him. It boils down to at least three really important takeaways.
First off, we start to see Calvin as more than just a religious figure. We see him as a product of Renaissance legal humanism. His thinking was molded by his deep reading of classical thinkers. It's a fantastic reminder that way before he was the John Calvin theologian, he was a brilliant legal scholar wrestling with the very nature of law.
Second, and this is a big one, it just shatters that old stereotype of the harsh, unforgiving disciplinarian. What we find instead is a Calvin who was genuinely worried about wrongful convictions, a guy who argued for using equity to give lighter sentences, not just to punish people more. He even applied this to the horrifying institution of slavery, arguing that masters should be guided by fairness, not the full brutal force of the law.
And finally, you really can't understand his whole ethical system without this piece of the puzzle. It shows us that for Calvin, natural law wasn't just a stick to beat humanity with for being sinful. No, it was also a positive, practical guide that rulers could actually use to govern justly in a messy, complicated world.
Which leaves us with a question that is, honestly, just as relevant and just as tough today as it was in Calvin's Geneva. When should we bend the rules to do what's fair? And maybe more importantly, who do we trust to make that call? It's a challenge that gets to the very heart of what justice is all about.